There's a lot of debate as to what a tactical shooter is and what a hardcore shooter is. This confusion doesn't just come from people who don't play shooters, but also those who primarily play shooters. It is something that is difficult to pin down. In my efforts of this series, I want to try and give more perspective and clarity about first-person shooters. In this case, I will also be mentioning some third-person shooters for more context. So let's start by creating a scale, grabbing a list of popular games and then placing it on this scale. The higher the game is on the scale, the more arcadey the game is. And the lower it is, the more tactical the game. Now to note, this isn't a list to determine skill, simply how these games are played. So while setting this list, let's talk about what would be an arcadey shooter. Well, an arcadey shooter is one with a lot of movement, a high time to kill usually, and these are games like Fortnite or Apex Legends. The movement and game mechanics in these games are designed to be abused to create more speed, build objects quickly, and so on. The actual gunplay tends to be basic, but still challenging. You may not be able to just hold down the trigger, but it doesn't take much skill to hit your targets either. The big skill gap in these games are mobility and tracking. Because these characters are fairly slim and can move quickly, the challenge is tracking those movements and staying on target. We can also put Halo and Overwatch in here as well for many of the same reasons. A long time to kill, gimmicky weaponry, and gadgets. Moving on, we have games that are more restrained, but aren't fully tactical. Not in the normal sense anyways. Counter-Strike, for example, is a mixed bag. Each weapon has its own recoil pattern, and they're not as easy to control as the previous games. In a deathmatch mode, you don't need to think at all. However, when you go into a ranked game, people change their playstyle. In this case, they're more direct about their movements, they use more throwable equipment and come up with strategies, much like a tactical shooter. However, the character movement still doesn't really make it tactical. When players can still quickscope and hop around, it doesn't really sit in as a tactical shooter. The time to kill in the game is also fairly low, so it's not quite an arcadey shooter either. In my opinion, it falls as a mid-ground between the two as a standard core shooter. Along this line, we also have Valorant, and although it is different, they have many similarities: hipfire, fast-paced gameplay, and a quick time to kill. So let's start with our first tactical shooter, Rainbow Six Siege. Right away, we have a difference in character speed. In exchange for this, we have more advanced movement types, such as leaning, going prone, and rappelling up or down walls. Instead of having movement abilities such as teleporting, the movement and gadgets are more intricate, putting an emphasis on using cover and the environment as much as possible, rather than trying to move around the environment as quickly as possible. With this said, Rainbow Six Siege is one of the most streamlined tactical shooters, to the point where players who play primarily tactical shooters will not touch the game. The reason being, the gadgets usually. Gadgets are the substitute for character abilities, and depending on the game, they can be crucial to winning each round. Just with Rainbow Six, there are so many of them, that's another layer of difficulty to remember who does what, who looks like who, and so on. On top of actually learning the gunplay, map layout, and the hotspots where players will typically be. In short, Rainbow Six Siege is a very streamlined tactical shooter that plays in its own unique way. Another hybrid-like shooter is Insurgency and its sequel, Sandstorm. Insurgency tries to toe the line somewhere between a hardcore shooter and a tactical shooter. With this said, we now have to discuss what a hardcore shooter is. So hardcore shooters are typically faster-paced games compared to tactical shooters. They tend to have the speedy gameplay from an arcadey shooter, with the low time to kill that you'll get from a tactical shooter. Usually you'll see hardcore game modes or playlists like in the Battlefield or COD series. So in a very short summary version, hardcore shooters are just regular shooters with less health. This is kind of the issue with saying any game in particular is only a hardcore shooter. It's more of a game mode than a full-on genre. In a way, any shooter can be easily converted to a hardcore shooter, or a hardcore version of itself by simply lowering the character's health. But not every game can fully support tactical gameplay. Just because a game can be played tactically, it doesn't mean it is. With this said, a tactical game like Insurgency can also be seen as a hardcore shooter, because of its combined low time to kill and fast-paced movements. You can also play Insurgency as a slow-paced tactical shooter. It all depends on the servers you're playing on and who you are playing with. We can also make a case for Modern Warfare 2019 to be a tactical shooter as well, only because it can be played like one. But we know that with the movement the game has, plus kill streaks and other gadgets, it lands itself further up to an arcade shooter. If we were to talk about a more grounded tactical shooter, we can look at Escape from Tarkov. EFT removes a lot of the gimmicky gadgets and the game becomes very slow and tactical, using any audio cues available and taking fights slowly. EFT has a slow time to kill, but it also has another feature. This is the wounding effect, which is different from linear health. So you can bleed out in this game if you don't heal up. Your character's body can also be wounded, so you may not be able to run if you have too much damage to your legs. This forces the player to take things slowly, as even taking non-lethal damage will still severely limit your mobility. Similar health mechanics can also be found in other realistic games like Squad, Project Reality, and Arma. Lastly, we have Milsim games such as Arma, Red Orchestra, and Squad. These games tend to land towards the tactical side of things, but they're also made for a very specific experience. These niche games don't tend to get the same reach as others because they're not made to be streamlined, usually. The enjoyment from these games comes from just being a part of a large battle. This is a similar experience to what you can get from the Battlefield games, but the current Battlefield franchise is designed to be easier to get into and faster paced, whereas these other games are designed to be slower and more realistic. Gunplay is a crucial part for every shooter, and as we discussed before, each game handles their weapons differently, and has different recoil even if they're representing the same exact weapon. Looking at Apex Legends, there is some decent recoil for their weapons. However, the weapons are still accurate with close-range hipfire, and the game heavily rewards run-and-gun gameplay. To contrast this, we can look at Rainbow Six Siege, where the overall recoil is harder to control. The movement is also a lot slower paced, and the characters will die instantly with one headshot. In short, arcade-like shooters will have easier to handle weapons and encourages on-the-move gunplay, compared to hardcore or tactical shooters that will reward players with better map knowledge, being efficient with their shots, and more deliberate about their limited movement. Briefly going through Milsim games, like Red Orchestra, players' weapons may handle differently if they're under suppressing fire. In other words, there may be additional elements that causes your character to not use their weapon normally. Recently, Escape from Tarkov is going to be including gun jams to their weapons, which will force your weapon to malfunction. It's elements like these that you don't typically see in mainstream games, and the reason being is because it's out of the player's hands. It's a non-skill, a random element that will stop you from playing normally. It is typically a detriment for a competitive shooter to include this, since there's no way for the player to counter these negative effects. It can also be very frustrating if it were to occur in a more casual shooter as well. So instead, it's used in a tactical or Milsim type game, as they can include some of these additional realistic features. Again, I'd always like to stress that each game requires its own type of skill. We can't say that Rainbow Six requires more skill in regards to recoil control and map knowledge. In the same way, Apex Legends requires more skill to abusing mobility and playing at a faster pace with a more open map design. Overall, you can learn from both games and use them in other shooters, just that some of those skills won't always translate well to another game. So with all this homework finally done, what is the difference? Well, hardcore shooters can borrow from both sides of the scale. The movement can be quicker compared to other shooters, but still have the more intricate movements such as leaning, going prone, or rappelling up walls. Hardcore can essentially break all the rules, so long as the overall player health is relatively low. I also would want to throw in that the weapons should also feel slightly more difficult than the typical arcade shooter, but with the pacing of the game being faster than a tactical shooter. Of course, we'll always have gray area games, and trying to categorize all of them can be like splitting hairs. So instead of trying to give each one a specific label outside of marketing the game, some may require to be called both a tactical and hardcore shooter, the same way some may need to be called a light tactical game. Something like Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon is technically a tactical game, but it has a lot of added elements that regular tactical players dislike. Tactical games tends to lean closer to stealth games, taking things slow, rarely sprinting around, and an overall more grounded and realistic feel. Movement tends to be more deliberate, and there's usually a penalty for trying to play fast, such as draining your stamina that could make your weapons handle worse, as well as a longer time to pull up the weapon after sprinting. These games rely more on using map knowledge and being crafty with your approach. The fun in tactical games for me is finding more than one answer to eliminate a target. Think similar to the Hitman games or Sniper Elite or the Sniper Ghost Warrior games. A tactical shooter may limit the player's mobility, but it gives players more choices to how they take the fight. The challenge from then on isn't who's a better shot, but who can use their environment, visual and audio cues to get the upper hand. So again, it isn't really a test of overall skill, it's just a different type of skill that this game rewards over others. It can get muddy trying to figure out how to categorize the number of these games. What we have to look at are the gameplay elements themselves. Players will have a fast-paced aggressive playstyle or a slower, more tactical approach in nearly any game. Game developers can only put so much restrictions to force players to play a particular way or to encourage a specific playstyle. On that merit, I think it's best to categorize each game based on these two factors. What did the devs want in their game, plus how the players are playing the game. For example, if a game claims to be tactical, but has quick scoping, jump shots, and an overall arcadey movement system, we kind of have to call it an arcade shooter. Having 100 gadgets in a game doesn't make it tactical. And if the game has a slow time to kill, well then it's a hardcore shooter at best. Hopefully this kind of makes things a little easier to understand, and at least gives you a baseline for categorizing shooters. Let me know if you agree or disagree, and let's talk about it. I am Mr. Rain, and thank you for watching.